Hi, everyone. My name is Evan Varation, and I'm the coordinator of Clarence School District Family Support Center. And today we have a really special guest who's going to be able to provide our community, our staff, and our students some background and information and support on how to cope and best support each other when dealing with grief and loss. So Anna Van Deen is with us today. She is the manager of the Wilson Support Center, which is an affiliate of Buffalo Hospice and Palliative Care. Anna has been a great partner for our office, both to provide resources for families that have been referred to us and who are in need, as well as providing other staff development for our school staff to best support our students when dealing with issues of grief and loss. Um, in particular, we've seen a good amount of referrals coming through our office this year for grief and loss. So we felt like this would be an opportune time to do this type of presentation, especially given that in the winter months, if you have either are currently experiencing or have experienced loss or an issue related to grieving recently, the winter months, especially in Buffalo, can be incredibly challenging. So we wanted to get some of this information and resource into the hands of folks probably when they need it the most. And most importantly, grief and loss is probably the one human experience that all of us of all ages at some point are going to kind of collectively share. So it's really important that we know how to do that, and as adults and as caregivers, that we know how to do that in ways that are going to help support our students and young people. So these types of situations become just situations that they experience in their life that are typical, as opposed to situations that become traumatic and have kind of a profound effect on them later in life in a negative way. So, with all of that being said, I would love to turn it over to Anna, and we'll get started.
Great. Thank you, Evan. Okay. So I think one of the disclaimers that I like to give out is just that even talking about some of these things can be a little activating. Grief is something that, as we'll talk about, has a way of poking its head back up even years later. And so I just always like to encourage people to take care of themselves, be mindful of how this is hitting you, and give you the permission to have a little mental space if you need to kind of check out for a second as we're talking about some of these things. But I'm really happy to be here and to talk about this topic because it is something that can be difficult to express and to have conversation around. One of the things that makes that so difficult is that we don't always share an understanding of what grief is. And if we start at the beginning with grief, it really comes down to when we bond or attach to the people, the places, and the objects that matter to us throughout our life. And that's what this photo illustrates. You see a parent holding a child and a child holding a doll. And you can see their arms are like links between each one. And if that was somehow threatened or gone, lost altogether, we would find it pretty reasonable that there would be a response to that. When I see this image, I always think of the child losing the doll and some sort of tantrum coming from that. Tears, maybe, batting a fist. And that's normal, that child is having emotions. And that's what grief is. Grief is a response to the threatening of those bonds, the loss of those attachments, which often happen through death. But there are many other life transitions that we all experience in our lives that are not death related, but usher in grief and loss just the same. And because they're not death related, they can sometimes be harder to identify. They might feel like they're diminished by other people, even if you're having a lot of upset around it. And that can actually really change the way that someone grieves and experiences that loss. So that's part of why this topic is important. And I like to provide this kind of grief 101 information from the start because we do come with our own understanding and this helps us get on the same page. In those experiences of loss, everyone is very different. So one person can lose a parent and another person can lose a parent and experience it very differently. Sometimes those people are siblings. Even with the same blood and the same family raised by the same people, their experiences are going to be different. There's a lot of twin studies that show this. And it really has more to do with your personality, the factors related to the loss or the death, um, the loss history, what that person has already endured, and any resilience that's been built up from that, and also the relationship to that person who is maybe estranged or lost. A lot of what we work with in the hospice bereavement team and the Wilson Support Center is death related. So the examples that I give tend to center around that aspect. I think that's what we're getting access for most. But within that, there's a lot of other experiences of loss, which we'll talk about. So, an individual experiencing grief will have one facet of them that is responding emotionally. And that is often the outward expression of grief that we're all familiar with. And it can look very different from one day to the next, even one moment to the next. It really happens across a whole spectrum and can be very different for that person, even from a loss today to a loss 5 years from now. So it could be shock and numbness. It could be anger. It could be a sadness and a longing. It may it may look more like guilt and or regret. But all of those things are valid, and often they're all kind of happening simultaneously. It's just a matter of which one is standing taller that day, and which one is being felt a little more intensely. The other piece of this grief response is a physical response. And I think this can be overlooked sometimes, but because we often don't think that our physical health and our emotional health are connected, but all of this is happening in one system, which is our body. And so they'll impact one another. A lot of the times, the physical symptoms that we're seeing are because people don't have an emotional outlet. So they're having emotions, but maybe they're not allowing themselves the time to identify them, much less give themselves the permission to express them. And so, contained within the body, that can really cause some physical symptoms to grief. We also just see in general, especially in kind of the acute days, the early days following a death, that those physical symptoms can be an appetite change up or down, a sleep change up or down, but it can be tension in the body, it can be nausea. This manifests in a lot of different ways for people. And part of that is because the brain is actually processing this similar to how it would process a stress response. So the brain is prioritizing what tasks need to happen, and what tasks are not related to survival, which bleeds into the cognitive response of grief. So we see that there is an aspect of people who feel very overwhelmed, and that is kind of the flooding of the brain. All of this information that's really complex and difficult to make sense of, um, it's as much as it needs to be attended to in the brain's priorities, it's not the most important thing. And so it'll focus first on the survival things. So a lot of people will say, I can't keep track of anything that people are telling me. I can't remember. New information is not sticking. It's a lot to coordinate. I'm dropping balls. And that's not like me. You can imagine that a lot of these physical symptoms and cognitive symptoms can create a lot of concern for people. And even if they are a normal part of grief, we still encourage people to get checked by their medical provider just to make sure there's not something bigger at play. We often see in hospice that caregivers put their own health aside in order to care for that hospice patient. And so when that hospice patient dies, it could be that all of that um, all that unmet need is now really coming to the forefront and needing attention. So there is a real need to have that medical care as well as the grief support. Social support when you're grieving really is key. This is an area that can indicate to grief professionals how someone will walk through their grief and how they may have help from people around them to normalize that and to make sure they have the opportunities to share memories. Sometimes what we see is that those social supports dwindle. It may be really difficult for social ties to witness someone grieving because it is painful. It's painful for that person grieving, and it's painful for people to witness. We see the people that we love most turning into someone different. And so that can make it really hard to remain as supportive. But ultimately, that is where some of this information about coping and supporting people in loss can be super helpful. Because if we can respond in ways that are actually helpful to people who are grieving, then that's going to aid them in their own experiences of these symptoms. You can imagine, and maybe you have some of your own experiences of grieving, going to someone that you thought you could trust that had been there for you before, and instead gave you a message that maybe made you feel judged, or like your grief was diminished in some way or not as important. Maybe the way you were going about your grief was wrong. So that's why some people will seek out support and then decide, no, I'm not doing that again. That didn't work out so well. So the social aspect is a really important area to keep an eye on. And finally, there's a spiritual element to this grief response as well. Whether people are connected to religion and they're in a faith, that can certainly be reaffirmed and reassured through a significant loss. It can also be challenged and questioned, and some people really have a crisis of faith. But even aside from that, just general spirituality of what matters to us, how we conceptualize the world and our role in it, those things can really be questioned as well. The whole world may feel like it's been flipped over, and we're reprioritizing, we're re-navigating and negotiating how we want to spend our time and what makes sense to us, what doesn't anymore. And that can be really upsetting as well. So that deserves just as much attention as any piece of this. When I talk about a significant experience of loss, like a death, that we would think of that as the primary loss. A non-death experience would be like a move, so moving towns, moving states, moving schools. It could be a job change. Maybe that necessitates the move. So we're talking about those transitions that maybe even are viewed as a positive change, but there is loss inherent in the change. So with a death, we would think of that as a primary loss. And then all of the ripple effects and the ways that life has changed moving forward would be considered those secondary losses. So some examples of that could be a loss of faith, we just talked about, loss of identity. I think this is especially poignant for caregivers or spouses. Spouses actually are no longer a spouse, they're a widow or a widower. They literally have to change their title, so they lose that identity. I've talked with parents who have lost their only child and they don't know if they're a parent anymore, or even parents who say, I don't know how to respond when people ask me how many children I have. So some of those losses that might otherwise be overlooked are very difficult. Loss of routine. We see a lot of our hospice patients, kind of the support that's around them have had to completely restructure their routine in order to support that patient. And so once that patient dies, all of that energy and focus then has nowhere to go. And again, that can be kind of unsettling and take some time to find that new routine, but that structure can be helpful. Loss of safety, again, feeling like, when is the shoe going to drop? My whole world has flipped upside down. What can I count on anymore? Loss of purpose. Perhaps I found a lot of purpose in caring for my loved one, or my purpose was to be a parent. My purpose was to have this relationship with this person. loss of self-confidence, kind of related to what matters anymore, and loss of hopes and dreams. The idea that when someone dies, we also lose that future that we had imagined with them. This next section is going to cover some myths and misconceptions. As I mentioned at the top, we all develop our own ideas of what grief is and what it's not, usually based off of our own personal experience, which I think as you grow older, you realize that other people have a lot of different personal experiences, and so they come to different conclusions. So it can be helpful to talk about these things because they're often determined earlier on in our lives when we maybe aren't given all the information, or maybe the information that's shared with us is not overt, it's not spoken. Instead, it's something that we've assumed. And so these myths and misconceptions are helpful to review. So again, that we're on the same page and we're approaching people with a very compassionate mindset. So a really common misconception is related to Dr. Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. So people believe, as her model has been kind of twisted to be perceived as, starting with denial, then I go through the anger phase, and then bargaining, depression, and acceptance. That's just not true. There are many different ways that people experience grief. Specific to that model, Dr. Kubler-Ross was actually studying people who were dying when she developed that model. It has since been applied to people who are grieving after the death of someone. I will say plenty of people identify with those 5 stages, but it's not the only way of approaching grief. There's a lot of other theories of how people navigate grief. And I think the concern here is that if this is the only way that people think there is to grieve, then it can be really shaming if I'm not doing it right, because that wasn't my experience. I actually never really felt like I was angry. That's okay. That's not a required step. So there's many other ways of understanding grief and applying that to your own personal experience. The 5 stages, I think, identify with so many people because it does highlight some really common emotions in grief, but that doesn't make them universal. That doesn't make them prescriptive or required. The other piece of this phase model, or you think of it as stages, is that it almost, I think for a lot of people, and Dr. Kubler-Ross did talk in her book about the stages that she never intended this, but I think that it ultimately still communicates this expectation that once I complete that first stage of depression or denial, then I can move on to the next. And it's going to be linear. I'm going to experience it in that order. And then once I get to the last one, I'm done. I've accepted, I can move on. And that's just really not the experience of grief that we hear from people. It tends to be a lot messier. In some ways, I wish that it was linear and it followed all of the stages, but the truth is that it is very messy, and it comes back with all sorts of different complexities throughout our lives. So this gets at the fact that some people think there is a right way to grieve, or the way that I'm grieving is right, or, I'm the only one who's really grieving in my family. The truth is that that's going to look differently across everyone, and even for yourself from one time to the next. So to have expectations on how we personally are going to respond to our grief, and certainly expectations for the way other people should be behaving, is a great way for us to set ourselves up to not be supportive. Being more open to what this is like for that person is going to be a much better approach. And we get a lot of questions from people that in different ways are asking, am I normal? Is this normal? They'll say, is it okay that I still have his shoes by the door 2 years later? Do you think it's weird that I still need to sleep with his pillow? Should I be worried if my family member still talks about the day that they died? There's behind all of these questions is this problematic or is this normal? When should I be concerned? And it really is unique to what's needed for that person. A lot of the examples I just gave are actually very healthy examples of a continued bond with the person who has died. We talk a lot about the fact that grief doesn't end a relationship, or I'm sorry, death doesn't end a relationship, that love is still there and that continues. It's a consideration of a fuller picture. It's not just that one behavior that makes it problematic. It's a full picture of the functioning and the health of that person. So just really illustrating that grief is unique for everyone and for every experience of loss. Many factors help to determine that. I think we've talked about that a few times. So along with this, there isn't a specific timeline for grief. Part of getting rid of those expectations. Dr. Kubler-Ross, in her decades of work that continued beyond the 5 stages of grief, continued to explore grief and bereavement and death and dying. And one of the quotes she comes out with, I really love, and I shared it here. It basically gets at the sense that grief is something that will change you, and you will get back to a person that feels more whole. Might not be the person you were before. In fact, we can almost assure that it won't be that same person, because that would actually negate any impact that person ever had on you, right? If we have meaningful people in our lives, they have influence on us. And when they die, we've lost that. We've lost that connection and we've lost that influence. And that is what we are grieving. So to go on forward as if nothing has changed would really be a detriment to their memory and their honor. I've called out the specific section on grief and childhood because a lot of these myths and misconceptions, or even the truths and the messages that we receive about grief, come to us early in our lives, usually with that first experience of loss, or maybe the first experience of death, whether it was a family member or maybe it was, a pet, or even just a squirrel in the yard. But some of these things are opportunities for us to really shape how our children and our teens today are able to understand their emotions, understand how to navigate them in healthy, productive ways, how to navigate asking for help and getting support, and even what it looks like to support one another. So whether we talk about something or we don't talk about something is a message that we're sending them. How we honor someone or just never talk about it anymore, those are messages that young people are absorbing. And I think any adult can probably think back on their own personal experience with that, thinking about when it was that they first talked about death or understood death or started questioning death, and all that came from that. So throughout different development stages, it's really important to me just to acknowledge that infants may not be grieving in the way, and they certainly aren't grieving in the way that we typically think, but they are capable of recognizing this change. So they would miss any familiar presence that would usually be there. And they can certainly sense the emotions around them and kind of pick that up like a sponge. And if that person who died was or has gone, maybe they've been incarcerated or hospitalized or moved altogether, and they're no longer within that routine of care, that also is a disruption to their life, and it is something that they can sense. Let me just go back to that. So some of what you help to support within all of that is going to look like increased physical touch so that they have that reassurance. It might be just some additional attention, a lot of just that reassurance, and then as quickly as possible to rebuild a routine so that that structure is a piece of safety again. As we get into more school-age children, we really anticipate that some of these common grief responses. So the panic can be very real for little ones. anger, bodily distress, certainly, because they may not have the language yet to really identify what's going on for them, what their experience is. And so they have those physical symptoms of grief. Um, they may talk about guilt, about feeling that for some reason they have something to do with what's happened. They may withdraw either from playtime, from family time. They might want more time in their room. They may also start to replace other adults into the space or the role of that adult that's no longer there. And they may assume some of the mannerisms of that person who is gone, as kind of a in their own way of replacing through their behaviors. Adolescents and teens, a lot of these have a similar through line, but the development stage might make them look a little bit different. So adolescents and teens may have magnified emotions. Instead of coming out through physical symptoms, maybe they have become more capable of identifying their emotions, and they're emoting in that way, in something more magnified than what you normally see. Body complaints are still very common, though, because we do see some teens diminish their own feelings in order to support, as if they are adults too, to support their adult people, their caregivers. They may find it very difficult to concentrate in class because their mind is very busy, kind of with the overwhelm of their grief. Self-doubt is really common in teenage years in general, and having a big change to your life can just add to that self-doubt, especially when, as a teen, they may be seeking to some sort of belonging. And if this is something that makes them different, that might make them more unsure of themselves. The secondary grief is the acknowledgement that in the teen years, these adolescents are gaining more responsibility. They're seen more as an adult. They may have more freedom, but through that growth, they are also losing what it meant to be a child, and the freedom that also comes with being a child, and being taken care of. And so there sometimes is just an underlying piece of the secondary grief, that then when there is a more urgent experience or significant experience of loss, that is only further magnified. And guilt continues to be a really significant emotion for adolescents as well. Because of that additional responsibility and freedom, they may feel that it was more on them to show up for that person or to care for that person. And they may see, especially through a death, they may see that as a failure of their care, even if in some way they understand that it wasn't them that contributed to that end. Across the board, and I say this mostly about youth, but even for adults, there are four major concepts that are really important to understand in order to have a solid view of what grief and what death are. The first one is that death is irreversible. So when we recognize that this is an issue, it's usually because a child is coming to us saying that, why didn't dad show up for my birthday? I thought he would come and see me for my birthday. Some behind that is some sort of disconnect between the fact that dad is not able to come back because he has died. And using that really clear language and direct language is important. Keeping it simple, but helping that child understand it's dad's not coming back because he died, not because you weren't good enough, not because you didn't do X, Y, or Z. So that's where some of the shaming can come in. And we will talk with adults now about a loss they experienced as a child, who are just starting to connect that, who didn't realize that they had been living with that sort of guilt or shame for so many years. So that's part of the reason why these concepts are so important, so that people aren't living with that sorrow and suffering for so long. All life functions end completely at the time of death. So if a child came to us and said something like, I want to go and bring a blanket to grandma, or we need to bring dinner over to auntie, that's indicating that this concept around life functions completely ending is not well understood. That they're feeling that that person, perhaps they were buried, and perhaps they're feeling that that person is cold. Maybe it's raining and they want to bring an umbrella to keep that person dry. There's a real care behind that, and I think in a lot of ways that can be really painful because they're feeling that there's something more they should be doing. To help illustrate that all life functions end completely, some counselors will have the child hold their breath as long as they can, but eventually they're going to have to take another breath. And that illustrates that they are alive, right? We all need breath in order to live, whether we're a squirrel or we're a human, we need air to breathe. And when someone dies, they no longer need to breathe. And so that can help to illustrate that difference. Also, if there is, a dead frog or a dead squirrel in the yard, where you're able to actually illustrate that, remember the frog that we found last spring, and that it wasn't moving anymore and it wasn't breathing anymore and it didn't need to eat or drink anymore. It didn't feel pain. Those are some of the life functions that we want to really illustrate for kids, and answer any questions around so that they feel a little more solid on it. I will say kids will ask questions repeatedly as well, and that's just part of their brain at that stage of development, really trying to solidify that understanding. And also sometimes they kind of test us to see if the answer is still the same. So to be repetitive is okay, just keep it simple and direct. The understanding that every living thing dies, so that this is just part of life. This gets back to the fact that it wasn't something that we did that caused this person to die. Our thoughts don't have power. Often children will be concerned that maybe because they were angry at someone and then they died, that thought had the power for that person's life to end. So to just normalize this as part of life. And that can help to just normalize these discussions about grief and the pain of the emotional pain that can come from experiencing a death. Finally, just again, addressing any possibility of some shame. There are physical reasons that someone dies. It's not our thoughts. This is what happened. The body shut down. This is what was in the body that caused it, or the heart was weak. To give them an explanation as to why this happened in a physical sense will be really reassuring, so that they're not having their own thoughts around, their supposed powers to have impacted this outcome. So maybe the most important piece of all of this is how we can help. As supportive adults and caregivers, how can we help? And how can youth look to us for support? So validating their emotions is number one always. And really that goes for adults too. But to honor the fact that what they're experiencing might have been different than what you were experiencing or what their friends were experiencing or what their aunt or uncle talked about, but that for them, that's okay. To maintain that structure as much as possible. As humans, we do a lot better with the safety of structure, but at the same time, we need to recognize that this is someone who is grieving and may not be able to obtain that same sort of performance or expectation that they had before. And so we need to have some flexibility within that structure so that they have an escape, they have a way out if they need to just say, I just don't have it in me today. Listen to their fears. I think sometimes this is not overtly stated. It's something that's kind of woven in and hidden, buried underneath some coded language. But to keep an ear out for that so that you can ask a little bit more about that. Like, it sounds like you might feel some guilt towards what happened. Does that ring true to you? And just keeping an eye on those fears can help to address any of those thoughts that aren't helpful, that might be impacting their self-confidence too. Welcoming questions, answering simply, connecting to additional support. I think most of what these pointers are, do not reach the level of counseling. And at a certain point, you might realize I've done as much as I can, and I think they still need a lot more support. So seeking that additional support, whether it's a group, whether it's the Family Support Center, whether it's us at the Wilson Support Center, seeking that additional support to make sure that all is cared for. And then seeking support for yourself, because as I said at the top of the presentation, this can start to cause some friction with our own experiences of loss. We may be close to this experience of loss ourselves, and so to support someone else can be really difficult. So make sure that you're supported as well, so you have something to give. When we talk about youth, it's really important to also talk about the support that school can extend, because they are in school so often, and a lot of their social support can come from that environment. A lot of their structure comes from that environment. So exploring with the family and the school, what that student would like messaged about this loss. So how is that being shared with their peers, with other staff? How much to share? That should all be in consultation between school and family or caregivers. Arranging for any accommodation. So like I said, having a bit of an escape plan, so that they can seek out additional support at school if they're feeling really overwhelmed in one moment. Maybe making adjustments to the curriculum to make sure that they're still meeting expectations and standards, any requirements, but maybe they can do so differently in a way that's more supportive to where they're at right now. I think ongoing communication between school and those adult caregivers is really important, and to include the student in that as well when appropriate. Creating the space for that student to take a break. Maybe it's a hall pass, maybe someone is designated as their buddy, but to make sure that they don't feel that they have to bottle their emotions in that moment, nor have to kind of let it out in an uncomfortable environment. Whether it's a peer or a trusted adult, and this trusted adult is not always a teacher, it's not always like a mentor at school, it could be a coach, it could be someone from like lunch hour, whoever it is that they connect to, maybe even someone from years past, if they're maybe in later middle school, later high school. So finding who that student feels comfortable opening up to, and supporting those people as well. And finally, I think a huge piece of school, and this doesn't have to be specific to any one experience of loss, but in general, is just guiding peers on how to be supportive, and what it looks like to show up for your friends. A big piece of support is often this question of what do I say and what don't I say? Because I know there are things that aren't that helpful. And I mean well, but sometimes it just comes out of my mouth wrong. So we have a whole handout that covers so many more than these 3 examples, but I think these 3 examples really hit the nail on a lot of what I hear clients sharing with us, saying something like, I know what you're going through. That really ignores the fact that their experience is unique, and that even if you both lost a parent, that's going to feel different for each of you. So instead, leading with, I know that it's going to be different for everyone. What's it been like for you? Let me know if there's anything I can do. This one is still difficult for me because we really do want to do something, and we want it to be meaningful to that person. And we don't want to overstep. We want to give them space, but also let them know that we're there. It ends up being a lot more helpful to just put something out there that's really concrete. Say, this is how I'm going to help to support you, and this is when. How are you? This is one, and even have a good day. That's one that I talked about with someone the other day. Thinking about the greetings that we have for one another, and just being more mindful about how we say hello to one another, and also the wishes that we send each other when we say goodbye. I'm wrapping up here, but I always like to include a slide about rituals because they are a very significant piece of grief that I feel can be overlooked. It's not always part of our conversations. There tends to be a very public ritual through a memorial of some sort, whether that's a funeral or Shiva or whatever your cultural ritual is, whatever that practice looks like. But having even ongoing personal rituals and points of connection for a loved one, it's something that we do as humans. It actually becomes very organic for people. They don't even really realize that there's a word for it, that that's a ritual. All it is really is an intentional time that you're in touch with your emotions and honoring that relationship. And we know from long before research was being done on grief, we know that cultures across the world have always engaged in ritual, especially when it came to death. And so finding ways for yourself can be really significant um, and very personal. In fact, the more personal it is, the better, usually. Um, when we're talking about youth, that's also something we want to support. That's also something that we want to approach with them, is what that looks like for them. And when we're talking about the public rituals, it is my perspective that it's really important to offer the opportunity to a student, to a child, to a teen, to participate, to attend or not, but to give them that choice. When that doesn't happen, we often see teens coming back and saying that they really resent never having that opportunity. So giving them the opportunity to say yes or no, supporting them in whatever that needs to look like, and even giving them an ownership or some sort of role. Maybe they can do a project that's on display. But to, again, bring them into the fold and show them, demonstrate to them, this is how we honor people after they die. This is how we show that they are meaningful to us. That's a really important piece. So the Wilson Support Center is available for literature, for therapeutic worksheets. We have a lot of different reading lists for adults and for little ones. That's sometimes the easiest way to broach some of these really difficult topics. I know I talk about some of these things as if it's just standard and straightforward, but I know that it's really, really hard to talk about these things. Even I can sit here and talk about these concepts with you abstractly, but in my own family and in my own personal life, it's much more difficult. So I know that sometimes it's helpful to have those lead-ins, especially with little ones, around books, because you can read a book with them about these concepts and then connect it to what they're experiencing in life. We also are accessed a lot for different support referrals, whether it's a grief support group somewhere or direct individual counseling. So the best course of action, since grief is different for everyone and everyone needs a different kind of support, it's just to give us a call so that we can really individualize our recommendations and what those referrals look like to meet your unique needs.
Just want to thank you, Anna, for coming on and providing this. This was incredibly helpful. Even, for me, listening to the presentation, there's aspects of my own life and the loss that I've experienced where some of the things that you described, you look back and it's like, man, I wish I would have known that, or I wish I would have had someone providing support through that lens. So what I do want to encourage folks who are watching this presentation to consider is, again, just the fact that you might have a child. If you're a caregiver, you might have a child at home right now. If you're a teacher or a school staff member, you might be working with a child. And this might be an experience that you have not kind of crossed paths with yet. And the more that you can get this information, the more that you can reach out. So I would encourage you, even if you haven't had this experience yet of supporting, in particular, a child with grief and loss, it would probably be of benefit to, obviously watching this presentation would be part of it, but to maybe reach out to Wilson Support Center, look on their website. They have some really wonderful resources, especially if you're a younger parent. Myself, being a new parent as well, these are things that I think about a lot more now. And I think having that on the front end, having some of this information about what to say, how to go about handling support, how to communicate with schools in terms of best supporting your child, having that on the front end really helps because when we are in these moments, it's really hard to remember what we're supposed to do, especially if we've never learned it before. So I encourage you to, reach out to the Wilson Support Center, but also if you have any questions or if you are in need of support with grief and loss or really anything else, you can feel free to contact our office as well. So Anna, I just want to thank you again and thank the Wilson Support Center for putting this on for us.
Thank you, Evan.
Have a good one.